Hey, what's going on, developers? In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how we can implement the refresh token functionality with Next-Auth and Axios Interceptors in Next.js version 13 project. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, I open up a Next.js version 13 project, and the first thing I want to do is to install the Axios as well as the Next-Auth. And since I've already installed these two packages, I just close this off. And next in the lib directory here, I'm going to create a Axios configuration file. So I'm going to say axios.ts. And inside this, first of all, I'm going to define the base URL, which is the base URL of our backend API. And here, keep in mind that this server, which is running on the port 8000 on our local host, is a Node.js project that is completely different from the current Next.js project that we are working on. So let's move on and let's export an Axios instance using the Axios.create function. And inside this create function, we're going to pass an object with the base URL. It's going to be this base URL that we've just defined. And in the header section, we are going to set the content type to the application/JSON. So that's it for now. And in the next step, let's create the Next-Auth configuration file. So I go to the pages directory, and inside the API, I'm going to create a directory called auth, and inside it we are going to create our Next-Auth configuration file, which is going to be inside the square brackets and say .next-auth.ts. And here, in order to speed up the process, I just copy and paste the configurations from the previous video's project, which is about the authentication with Next-Auth in Next.js. So remember, this is not a detailed tutorial about the Next-Auth. And if you are not familiar with the Next-Auth package, I highly recommend you to watch that video, which its link is on the screen card and also in the description below. But before moving on, let me quickly review what we have in this file. So as you can see, we have the auth option, and inside the auth option object, we have specified the providers. In this case, we use the credential providers. So that means that we want to authenticate our user with just a username and password. And down here, we have the authorize method, which takes the username and password of the user inside an object called credentials. And here, as you can see, we send a post request to our backend API auth/login. So remember here, we have set the base URL of the Axios to the localhost port 8000. So here we send the post request to our backend API. And inside the body of this request, we extract the username and password from the credentials object and send them to the backend. And then we extract the user from the response, and then we check that if the user is not undefined, we return the user to the session of the Next-Auth, and else, which means that the user is undefined or null, we just return null, which means that the user is not authenticated. And down here, we have the callbacks object, which inside it, we have defined two functions, JWT and session. We have defined these two functions because we want to preserve our AccessToken and also RefreshToken. So I have a detailed video about how to handle the AccessTokens inside the Next-Auth session, and you can watch it if you want to know about what these functions, JWT and also session, in details. And then we export the Next-Auth with the auth option that we just defined. Okay, that's it for the configurations of the Next-Auth. And before moving forward to the next section, let me introduce you the backend API that we are going to use in this tutorial. So I go to the Insomnia. Insomnia, as you know, is kind of like the postman. So here you can see that we have a backend login API, And in the body of this login API, we send the username and password. So if I click on the send, we get a JSON response that describes the user object, and also it gives us a access token as well as a refresh token. Another API that we are going to use is the refresh API. And in the body of this refresh API, we send the refresh token that we've got from the login API to get a new token. I set the expire time of the access token to just 10 seconds and the refresh token to 14 days. This 10-second expire time of the access token is not realistic. In real-world project, we usually set the expire time of the access token to 5 minutes, more or less. But in this video, we can't wait 5 minutes for our access token to be expired. So for testing purpose, I set the access token expire time to just 10 seconds. Another API that we are going to use is the user post. This API gives us the posts of a certain user with this ID. So if I click on the send, we get an unauthorized 401 error. And that's because we didn't include our access token in the authorization header of this request. So I go back to the login API, click on the send to get a new response, and then copy the access token from the login API, go to the post request, and in the authorization header, I say bearer, a blank space, and then paste our access token. So now if I click on the send, we get the post of this user. Okay, now we can go back to our VS Code and save this Next-Auth configuration file. I go to the app directory, and here you can see that we have an app bar from our previous video that has a sign out and sign in functionalities, and then a layout in which we wrap our whole application with a provider's component, and inside the provider's component we wrap the children of this provider's component with a session provider that comes from the Next-Auth/React. So in this way, as you know, we can access to the use session which is provided by the Next-Auth. And as you know, with use session, we can access to the Next-Auth session in our pages and components. And also we have a home page here, and in this home page we have a button here, and when we click on the button, it calls the fetch post, which we haven't defined yet, but it's going to fetch the post of the user. So now let's quickly define the fetch post function. So I'm going to say const fetch post equals to async function. Then inside it, we are going to call our Axios instance. So I'm going to say const res equals to await Axios, and then import the Axios from the lib/Axios. So if I go to the lib directory and Axios.ts file, you can see that we have exported an instance of the Axios with this base URL, which is our backend API. So I'll go back to the page.tsx, and here I say Axios.get, and then put our backend API here, which is /test/user, ID of the user, and then its posts. And after that, we set the post state with the response.data. So I'm going to say res.data. Okay, now let's run our server. Here, as you can see, we are logged in, and here is the name of the user. So if I click on the get user post, we get an 401 unauthorized error, and that's because we didn't include our access token here inside the get request to the backend API. So let's close this off and do this with the Axios Interceptors. And in order to do that, first of all, I go to the Axios.ts file and create another instance of the Axios. So I'm going to say export const Axios auth equals to Axios.create, and then just copy this piece of code here, and we're good to go. In the next step, I'm going to create a folder here called hooks in the lib directory. And inside it, I'm going to create a custom hook called useAxiosAuth.ts. And here I'm going to say const use Axios Auth equals to a function, and in the body of this custom hook, first of all, I'm going to access to the session of the Next-Auth. So I'm going to extract the data from the use session hook and then rename it to the session, set it to use session hook, which comes from the Next-Auth/React, and in order to access to this use session hook, I'm going to mark this custom hook with the use client. Okay, now after the use session, I'm going to use the useEffect hook, and inside it, I'm going to pass an callback function, and inside this function, I'm going to set an interceptor for the Axios. So I'm going to say const request intercept equals to Axios Auth, which we have created in the Axios.ts file here, as you can see. Go back to the use Axios Auth, and here set the Axios Auth.interceptors.request.use, and then inside it I'm going to pass a callback function which takes the config as its parameter, and then inside this function I'm going to check if there is not authorization header in the request, just add it. So I'm going to say if not config dot headers of the authorization, set the config dot headers of the authorization to a string that contains the bearer token. So I'm going to put the bearer string, which it has to be there, and after that a blank space, and then put the session.user.accessToken. So I'm going to say session.user.accessToken. So as you can see, the access token is not present in the user's property. So in order to fix this, I go to the types directory of our project. If there is not a types directory in your project, just create one, and then inside it I'm going to create a file called next-auth.d.ts, and inside it I'm going to import the Next-Auth from the Next-Auth, and then declare a module called Next-Auth, and inside it I'm going to define an interface called session. Just pay attention to the spelling. And inside the session we have a user object, which its type is an object that has these properties that comes from our backend API. So as you can see, it has an access token and also refresh token. For more information, you can watch my previous video on this topic, which its link is now on the screen and also in the description below. So I save this and go back to the use Axios Auth, and then here open the list of the user properties. As you can see, we have access to the access token here. So let's save this and then return the config in this callback function. And for the last step in this section, in the cleanup function of the useEffect, we have to eject this request intercept from the interceptors of the Axios Auth. So I'm here in the cleanup function. I'm going to say Axios Auth.interceptors.request.eject the request intercept that we've just created. And then in the dependency array of this useEffect, we put the session because we have used it in this useEffect. And after the useEffect, we just return the Axios Auth from this custom hook and then export default the use Axios Auth. And that's it for this section. And let's go to the home page and use the use Axios Auth that we just created. So I'm going to say const Axios Auth equals to use Axios Auth. So if I go back to the use Axios Auth custom hook, you can see that we return the Axios Auth from this custom hook. Go back to the home page, and here in the fetch post function, instead of using Axios, I'm going to use Axios Auth. and then send a GET request to this backend API. So I go back to the browser and let's sign out and then sign in with my username and password. And here, if I click on the Get User Post, you can see that we didn't get an unauthorized 401 error. But after 10 seconds, if I click once again on the Get User Post, again, I get an 401 error because the access token has been expired after 10 seconds. So in order to fix this problem, we should use the refresh token to get a new access token and then use our new access token in the GET request to the backend API. So let's do that. I go back to the VS Code, and here in the hooks directory, first of all, I'm going to create another custom hook called useRefrshToken. And inside it, I'm going to export const useRefrshToken and set it to a function. And inside this function, first of all, we have to extract the session from the use session. So I'm going to say const extract the data from the session and rename it to just session, set it to use session hook. And since we are using the use session hook, we just have to mark it with the use clients and then define a async function called RefreshToken. Inside it, I'm going to call the Axios. So I'm going to say const res equals to await Axios that post to our backend API /auth/refresh. And then inside the body of this post request, we have to pass the refresh, which is extracted from the session.user.refreshToken. And then after that, we check if the session is existed. We set the session.user.accesstoken to the res.data.accesstoken. And then return this refresh token function from this custom hook. So you may wonder why we're using a custom hook for exporting this refresh token. And that's because we are going to use the use session hook inside the refresh token. So in order to do that, we should return the refresh token inside a custom hook because we can't use hooks inside regular function in React. So let's save this and close this off. Go to the use Axios Auth custom hook, and here in the use effect, we define a response interceptor this time. So I'm going to say const response intercept equals to Axios Auth dot interceptors dot response this time dot use. And then inside it, we're going to pass two functions. The first one is the response function, which takes the response as its parameter. And since we don't want to modify the response, we just return the response. But if we were to modify the response, we could modify it inside this function. And then the second one is the error function, which is going to be async and takes the error if there is any error. And then inside this function, first of all, we get the previous request. So I'm going to say const prev request equals to error.config. And then we check that if the status code of the error is 4.1. So I'm going to say if error.config.response.status is equal to 4.1 and the prev request.send is not true, then first of all, set the prev request.send to true. And in this way, we make sure that this logic runs only once after the 4.1 error has been occurred. And then here we have to refresh our token. So first here, after the use session, we extract the refresh token function from the useRefrshToken customer that we have defined earlier. So I'm going to say const refresh token equals to useRefrshToken. And then down here, after the setting the pref request.send to true, we call the refresh token. So I'm going to say await refresh token. So in the refresh token, if I go to the useRefrshToken, you can see that we update the user.AccessToken in the session with the new access token that we've got from the refresh API from our backend server. So I go back to the use Axios Auth.ts file, and here after the refreshing token, I'm going to set the pref request.headers of the authorization to the new access token that refresh token function updated for us. So I put the bearer string and then put our session.user.access_token, which, as I mentioned, is the new access token after the refresh token has been run. And for the last step, we return the Axios auth and then pass the pref request into it. And after the if block, we say if the status code of the error is not 401, we just return the promise that reject the error. And here in the cleanup function, I'm going to say Axios auth.interceptors.response.eject the response intercept. And one thing we forgot here is the error function in the first request interceptor. So after the first function, we pass the error function. We just return the promise that reject that error. So that's it for the use Axios auth. So let's go back to our browser now. Let's refresh the page. And here let's sign out and then again sign in. And here put my username and password. As you can see, if I click on the user post, it retrieves and renders the post of the user into the screen. But after passing more than 10 seconds, again, it should not give us an error because it automatically refreshes the token when it gets the 401 error. So obviously it has been passed more than 10 seconds after our login. So let's again click on this get user post. It again gives us the 401 error, so it shouldn't give us an error. So let's go back to our VS Code and double check here. We refresh the token and set the authorization. Oh yeah, we misspelled the bearer string, and yeah, I think it is now okay. And if I go back to the browser and let's sign out, again sign in. Get the user post, wait for 10 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now if I click on the get user post, it again gives us the user post and fetches the post of the user without any error. So automatically it will refresh the token for us. So in order to make sure that it is refreshing the token, let's go back to the VS Code and inside the refresh token function here, let's just log the refresh string here in the console. Let's save this and open up the console. Okay. So go to the console. Obviously, it has been passed 10 seconds after refreshing the last token. So if I click on the get user post, you can see that first we get an unauthorized because the token has been expired, and then the response interceptor automatically refresh the token, and in the screen you can see that we get the data from the backend API without any error. So for the last thing, to make sure that the data is being fetched from the backend, not from the cache, let's go back to the home page add another button here, and on the onClick event of this button, let's say set post to an empty array, and let's name it the clear post. Well, let's set post to the undefined, yeah, and let's clear the post. And as you can see, the post has been cleared, and open up the console, clear the console, and get user post. First of all, as you can see, we got an 401 error because the session has been expired, and then it refreshed the token, and then it retrieved the data from the backend API with the new access token that we've got from the RefreshToken function. And yeah, I think that's it for this video, and we have successfully implemented the RefreshToken functionality with Next-Auth and Next.js version 13 project inside our client components. So what about the server components? Well, that will be the topic of my next video in this series. So if you like the video, please give me a thumbs up and hit the bell button in order to get informed about my next video in this series. Bye-bye.